So if there was one thing that you wish people knew, what would be that one thing?
These children are not broken, but that they are burdened. They're burdened by a imbalanced microbiome, by toxins that their little bodies are unable to clear, by a biology that's treatable. We can have meaningful improvements, like real meaningful improvements, if we address these issues for each individual child.
Welcome to the show. Today we have Dr. Christian Bogner, and I'm very excited for this show because, before I knew a lot about health, I would go to the doctor. I remember specifically I went to the doctor with wrist pain one time. And even though I was like the lightest I've ever been in my life, the doctor told me I needed to lose weight. And I would always get that stuff. Like I would go to the doctor with back pain, you need to lose weight. And I got really frustrated. I know that's a lot of people's story because it's like, no, I want you to address that one thing, but you're telling me to do something else. Mm-hmm. And people come to you with an autism diagnosis sometimes, or a lot of time, and you say, we may need to look at your gut. And so you do the thing that I used to think was so frustrating. Mm-hmm. And we're going to explain all that today. So welcome. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. It's a pleasure. You have a beautiful studio here. So yeah, happy to talk about anything that you and your listeners would like to hear.
So I just want to hear your background first. So like, where did you go to school? What did you want to kind of specialize in? How did you kind of switch into what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Germany, and I went to school in Europe. I came over here, did my residency in Michigan in OBGYN. My dad is an OBGYN, so I grew up in that household. That's all I knew. And I worked in that field for about 12 years. Busy surgical practice, seeing a lot of patients every day. And however, at the age of 2, my son, he's going to be 21 this Saturday. He was diagnosed with autism, and at that time, I didn't know anything about autism. We didn't learn about this in medical school at all. And, the solutions that I was offered was just, hey, this is, a neurodevelopmental disorder, speech therapy, ABA, OT, that's it. No investigations of, hey, what could have caused this? Because it was strange. He was saying words. He was developing normal. It was my first child, but from what I could see, there were no concerns. He had some gut issues. But from one day to the next, and I believe it was because of the vaccine, during that time, he regressed. He lost all of his words, and he engaged in this repetitive behavior, tantrums and sleeping difficulties, gut issues. And so when I went then to the pediatrician, they basically said, sorry, this is, we have to get him evaluated. And eventually he did. And he was diagnosed with autism. And I was shocked that, wait a minute, something happened, it's like an injury or poisoning or something.
So how old was he when he started?
He was 2.
2. So he was perfectly healthy before 2.
Perfectly healthy. Yeah, he had some gut issues, maybe a little delayed in speech, but he did have words, and he was smiling, and he had eye contact. And so there were no major concerns that would alert me to get, or have somebody look at him earlier. And that was just very frustrating. And I couldn't believe that there was no investigation. Just with simple blood work, is everything okay there? Or, later we find there's many more tests that you can do, of course. But back then, that was it. So I started immediately to, I had all the resources at my fingertips in regards to publications and articles and research. And day and night, I couldn't put it down. I was like, oh my God, why is nobody talking about gluten or casein? And that maybe restricting those could improve the condition. And so that's how I started to get into this, and haven't stopped for the last, 19 years now. And I think we've come a long way.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was just listening to Jenny McCarthy was on a podcast, and she was saying, 20 years ago, you couldn't talk about being gluten-free without being a crazy conspiracy theorist. And now everyone's gluten-free. So yeah, that's crazy. So at what point Were you like, okay, I need to switch my practice from OB to autism?
Well, I was in a very successful OBGYN practice. I had a good gig going on. I was only working in the hospital at the end and was making a good living. But my heart was just constantly, when I was in the call room reading about autism, oh my God, and one door opens and you're like, wow, and then 10 other doors open. And so it's never stopped. There's just so much information out there that's not being discussed. And I finally realized, I want to do this, full time. I need to dedicate my life to trying to help my son and other children. There are millions affected. And it was just very frustrating to always hear, that this is it. Your child is basically broken, and we can maybe try to improve some things with behavioral therapy to drill this into them, like you're training a dog. And so I was thinking, if nobody's doing it, I have to do it. Stop complaining and get to work. And yeah, that's when I joined a center that was offering hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And so they hired me as a medical director to do consultations for families with autism. And I worked there for 3.5 years. We grew the company to have an ABA program through a different provider. And I just kept doing consults every day, Monday to Friday, meeting with families, learning what these families have done, where they have gone, where they have traveled, what kind of therapies they have done, and just listen and learn, what kind of testing they have done, interpreted tests, correlated with the symptoms that the child had. And, over time, you started to see patterns that, each child really is very different. And yes, all of the testing that you're going to get, they're all going to come back up normal. But, what was frustrating is that despite this, having all of these tests come back up normal, it was still unclear what the origin was for all of these abnormalities, from organic acid testing to mitochondrial issues to inflammatory markers being high, toxins being high. Like, why is this all there? And why does a child who doesn't have autism not have these issues? And over years and years and learning, I eventually met my colleague that I work with for the last 4.5 years now. His name is Alex Aherikis. He's a physicist. He is a son affected like me. He is in Tucson, Arizona. He worked as a radiation oncology physicist. So he's a really smart guy. And what he did is he realized that the symptoms of his son were correlated with when his son had to have a bowel movement. So meaning when he needed to go poop, it's almost like that he had a fever. He could feel it. He was burning up. And he started to get into testing the microbiome. And by then, and still until today, I think not many functional medicine practitioners even know about this type of testing, but it's called 16S. Okay. It's a DNA type test for the microbiome. And the difference is to conventional stool testing, even in the functional medicine world, is that it's not culture-based, but it's literally just quantifying the DNA of bacteria. And you can take a look at the entire ecosystem of bacteria. As you know, we have a human has between 500 and 2,000 different species of bacteria. And conventional tests that we usually get in functional medicine maybe check for 30 or 40. They list whatever they think is important. But this takes a snapshot of the entire ecosystem, and it can basically detect bacteria that otherwise would be missed. Even some are very significant. If they should be less than 1% of the entire population, sometimes we find them to be 50 or 60% of the entire population. And then you realize that certain bacteria like that are highly overgrown can produce toxins like lipopolysaccharide, LPS, or oxalates, or ammonia, or other toxins. And you don't have to be an expert, I think, to realize that this is not normal. When it should be 1%, it's 60%. And anyway, he started to look at this, Alex, and basically search the entire literature that's out there, and for example, if you have Clostridium overgrowth, it's a bacteria that's part of us, but it can produce toxins, it can produce neuroactive chemicals like tryptamines. The literature says, well, there's a beneficial yeast. It's called Saccharomyces boulardii. You can use that, and the Clostridium will go down while it leaves the other bacteria alone. Just contrary to antibiotics, which would lower Clostridium, but it will kill everything else. It's like a nuclear bomb. And so he searched IntelliTrue for all of these bacteria that we found elevated in these kids and started to come up with basically 6-week treatment plans. Like, hey, here's a schedule Monday to Sunday. Start taking these things based on your results. And then at 6 weeks, we send surveys to these families, extensive surveys. What did you observe? Is he pooping better? Is he sleeping better? Is he having more eye contact? Is he behaving better? And at the same time, retesting to see what have the 6 weeks of intervention, how has that changed the microbiome? And so we did this. He did this over and over and over, learning, when I give ginger, this bacteria goes down. So
wow,
with this experience now over about 3,000 stool samples, really know what works and what doesn't. And at the same time, we correlate this improvement in the microbiome with, clinical improvement. Like we have children that start speaking again. We have it doesn't matter what age. We had a 29-year-old that was in a group home. He's actually the son of a very famous autism researcher that died in 2015, Jeff Bradstreet.
Okay.
And I can mention that because I interviewed the mom myself. And he was in a group home, and he came to us, barely verbal. And he had a horrible fungal rash on his back. And so we started with him with this program. And within 6 months, he was fully conversational.
Wow.
He didn't qualify for the group home anymore. He's now having a full-time job, and the family thinks it's a miracle. And, when...
It sounds like one. I mean, because I know quite a bit about autism. So, I know how impactful that is. But for people who may not understand, I want you to back up and explain what autism is and the different levels, because a lot of people, most people think of autism as being a little, antisocial, or, the person that graduated Harvard and then found out they were autistic, but that's not always the case. So can you kind of explain what autism is, how broad it can be, and the different levels?
Yes, of course. So I don't really follow the mainstream definitions. The mainstream definition of autism is it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. There's no mention of any triggering factors or toxins whatsoever. When 90% of my patients that I survey before they even engage with me, I have this questionnaire and I ask them, what do you think caused your child's autism? Just, open question. And probably 90+% of these parents say that the vaccine was involved. And,
really?
I'm just that's the data I look at, not what paper that was published in that regards, which could be false, driven by other interests.
Yeah, paid for. Yeah.
And so I listen to the parents. And, in regards to the phenotype of autism, how the umbrella of autism, yes, it's kind of ridiculous. Autism doesn't mean anything. If you say, there's a child that has problems with anxiety and socially, and they don't avoid eye contact, yet they are able to play the piano and they're, acing complex math problems beyond their age. But on the other corner, you have a child that doesn't sleep and is banging his head at 2:00 in the morning, screaming and biting the skin off his hand, or beating up mom. It's really not the same. But the question is it driven by a kind of a common denominator? And that's what we're trying to explore. And so for me, autism doesn't really mean anything. It's just a word. It's really something completely different. I hope one day we will redefine autism.
Yeah, everything needs to be separated out, because the severe end is nothing like, the moderate end and everything.
Correct. Yeah.
And that causes a lot of hostility. And when I talk about autism, it's typically about severe autism, because those are the parents and everything that I talk to as well. And I had made a video saying that I've never talked to a parent of a severely autistic child that said it was a gift, because that is the propaganda that's used to protect pharma, is that don't say anything negative about autism. It's a gift.
Right.
And I have never heard that from a parent of a severely autistic child. And then the next comment I get is, why are you asking the parents and not the child? Why aren't you asking their opinion? Well, most of them are nonverbal.
Correct.
You can't ask them. That's why I'm talking to the parents.
Right.
But when you don't see it, because you often don't see these people in public, because they're often under 24/7 care at home, because they are headbanging and screaming and, in diapers as adults. So they don't go outside the house very often. So for most of society, when you don't see it, you don't believe it. But that is what, like 20% or 30% of all the autism diagnosis are on the severe end?
We don't know, because of exactly that reason. They're being kept away, and a lot of parents have given up seeing their pediatricians. And they don't know that there's help out there. And but yeah, I mean, the parents that I see mostly have children affected with severe autism. They are ready to engage in other modalities in functional medicine, and it's tough. The stories that I've heard over the last 8 years, they really go under his skin. There's a lot of negative energy coming at you, pain and anxiety and horrible stories. I mean, it's beyond. Even some children that died because of their seizures or other complications of encephalitis. And yeah, these cases you don't hear about. You hear about maybe this, here and there, a child is drowning because they eloped. But, what I came to the realization about 3 years ago is that we cannot judge a child's intelligence based on their behavior. And that was kind of a huge click, because I started to meet individuals that were nonverbal, like you said, but that learned how to communicate with either spelling, we call it, spelling to communicate, or by typing. And in the beginning, it seemed almost too strange to believe, that such a strange behaving child that's screaming, jumping, not sitting still, is able to have, pretty complex intellect. And that started to then appear more and more into at least my arena of visibility, where there was a documentary called Spellers by J.B. Hadley and Dana Johnson, who is a professional spelling to communicate instructor in Tampa. And we saw 6 teenagers that were behaving very strangely, but yet they were poets. They were going to high school, they were going to college, they had dreams, they had aspirations. And so for me, it clicked that autism is not really damage to the brain, but it's just a disconnect between the mind and the motor system, between the mind and the body, that they literally have no control over their body. And so I started to look into that direction, what could be driving this. And I think we found some very interesting answers right now. I'm involved in a study with Stanford and UC Davis and LSU to explore certain biomarkers that are produced in the microbiome that are driving this entire clinical picture of autism. So it's very exciting. I think it's going to change a lot. And these molecules are what we call indole tryptamines, which are actually having psychedelic potential. And we can dive into that in great detail if you want, in regards to the chemistry of how it works and which areas of the brain and why it explains autism. But yeah, I think I haven't really talked about that yet, because we're just getting the IRB approval to study this in autism, to measure these biomarkers. But I think once we confirm that, I think it's really going to change a lot in our understanding of what drives autism.
So for people who say it's genetic, autism is just genetic, I always thought that was interesting, because I'm pregnant. I just got a genetic test done, and there's no genetic test for autism. So if it was just genetic, why wouldn't you just get diagnosed with a genetic test. But instead, autism is diagnosed through the DSM-5, a behavioral test.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your response to people who say it's genetic?
Well, show me the proof. It's never been proven. If we would know, I wouldn't sit here, because that would basically mean that's it. There's a genetic mutation, and there's nothing you can do about it. When you look at autism and how the rates have changed, from 1 in 10,000 in the 1980s to now 1 in 36, in the evolution of humanity, that's a very tiny time frame.
Mm-hmm.
And usually genetic drifts like that with de novo mutations would not cause this rapid increase in autism. So I think, many studies now in reputable journals even confirm that there are environmental factors involved with it. So, there's a difference between having a genetic mutation that causes like a gene missing, for example, that's coding for protein that we need in development, and difference between what we call a polymorphism, a change in the gene, depending on what your parents have equipped you with. Remember, every gene we have 2 copies of, one from mom, one from dad. And we can inherit slower or faster working copies. And these polymorphisms, I've worked with them for about 4 years in genetic testing. Like most people probably know about MTHFR. Mm-hmm. But there are many others like MTHFR. MTHFR is just a drop in a bucket. They're genes that break down histamine. And if you have a slower working gene for breaking down histamine, you have higher histamine levels, because if the toxins hit your blood, the histamine sticks around longer, and you have consequences clinically of what you see in the patient. They might have trouble going to sleep, or they're hyperactive because of the histamine. Or, you have genes that have problems breaking down serotonin or adrenaline, like MAO or COMT, these types of genes. And if you have that, you can't break down dopamine. Your mind is constantly pumping out, processing information. And to the observer, it seems this child has no attention or nothing, when in reality, their brains are going wild, thinking, solving problems that we would never understand, really. It's more on the level of schizophrenia, where you have constant thoughts, which are not necessarily bad thoughts, but the brain is just overactive because of the dopamine. So if you can break that down because your gene is working slower, yes, you have that type of phenotype. Or COMT is another example. COMT breaks down adrenaline. There are people that break it down slower, like me, and there are people that break it down quicker. So the people that break it down slower, when the adrenaline hits, like let's say you get pissed off, you're just pissed off longer, and it affects you more, and you worry more. That's why people with a slow COMT are called worriers, and people who break it down quicker, they're the adrenaline junkies. They're called the warriors. They like to jump out of an airplane or, do some free climbing or something.
Yeah, that's probably me.
Oh, that's you? Yeah, it's not me. I'm scared of heights. So
me and my husband are total opposite. Yeah, he does like to do roller coasters or anything. And I'm like, take me on everything.
Roller coasters are cool. I only do it because I have to, because of my kids. But Cedar Point was fun. Yeah. But at the end of the day, even having these genes, it just means basically that there's a genetic susceptibility, but that there has to be an environmental trigger. And I mean, if you look at how many vaccines we got in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, how they went up from 12 vaccines to 78 vaccines by the age of 18, by the introduction in the 90s of glyphosate, which is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's in the rainwater that's collected in the South. It's in your baby formula. It's in your prenatal vitamin. When I was an OBGYN, I sent it in for analysis, these samples that we give to patients. I don't want to mention the company, but I sent it in. It was a popular brand because it had soy as the other ingredient in there, in the prenatal vitamin. And I'm like, wait, soy is a GMO, so maybe it has glyphosate in it. And sure enough, it came back positive. Glyphosate, I mentioned that, is because it's such a tricky molecule. In the parts per billions, this molecule kills good bacteria in your gut, lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. These bacteria that when a baby is born, 80% of the bacteria of the baby are bifido. And the reason that's important is because bifido and lactobacillus, these good bacteria that we have, they keep the pH very low in the gut, which makes it unfavorable for other bacteria to grow wild. And so if you harm these bacteria with glyphosate, which is in your formula, which is in breast milk even, in every other food basically, and you add antibiotics, when antibiotics are given out like candy nowadays, when they just have a viral infection, a good doctor should see that. Just wait and watch.
Yeah, I'm surprised I'm still standing because I had antibiotics multiple times a year as a kid because I constantly had double ear infections. And, it was always give me antibiotics, but never tell my father not to smoke in front of me.
Okay, yeah.
So that was always what inflamed me.
No, I overall think that the combination of vaccines and environmental toxins like glyphosate are the driver for this to kind of, they're the trigger. They don't explain one thing. They don't explain why when a child gets diagnosed at the age of 2, they're still having the same behaviors at the age of 40. So that doesn't really explain it at all if you think about it. And on the other hand, if everybody talks about toxins, from aluminum to parasites to whatever toxins, glyphosate, LPS, all of these would be harming the brain, you would think, right? And everybody talks about, causing brain, inflammation. But if a child gets diagnosed at 2 and then you do an MRI and then you do an MRI again at the age of 40, you wouldn't see any structural damage to the brain. No sclerosis, which is scarring of the brain. We don't see that. We see normal appearing brains. There are some areas, if you do deeper MRI studies that show, some areas are not connected as well. But what's interesting is that what we do see, and there's a lot of studies coming out of Johns Hopkins with Moskowitz and his group that showed that there are actually areas that are hypermyelinated, and so that there are regions in the brain that connect that you and me might not have strong connections with. And that's why it's so interesting, the more autism individuals that I meet that are able to spell, they sit through the consult, but, they behave strangely, but you put the board in front of them, they start spelling. It's incredible. So we have kind of a bridge into their mind of what they're thinking.
And even though a majority of people would say it's genetic, anytime you look at any medical group, they all say, even Europe says on their website, the European Union, that we don't know the cause of autism, but it probably has something to do with environmental factors. That's typically what medical groups say. And so then people bring up vaccines and it's like, no, it's not that. Well, I thought you didn't know what it was. Right. And it's kind of interesting how I got into this. So I'm just a very curious person and I have a lot of random questions all the time. And I was following someone who breeds horses and cows and stuff. And cows eat their placenta. Mm-hmm. This was years ago. And so I was like, I know some people encapsulate their placenta and eat it, but should women eat their placenta in some way? And so I looked at a bunch of studies and it's like, no, don't do that because there's a lot of heavy metals in the placenta. So then my next question is, are those heavy metals crossing the placenta into the baby? Yes, they are. And it's mercury, lead, cadmium, all the things. So then the question is, okay, where are all those things coming from? Right. And it's our environment. So when we say environmental factors, is it the water that has lead in it, has fluoride in it that we're drinking? Is it the aluminum in the vaccines? And I mean, I'm no expert like you are, obviously, but just from what I've seen, I feel like it's a combination of many things. And then there's just kind of maybe one thing that pushes them over the edge. Mm-hmm. So it could be because formula feeding is very high. You have a high chance of autism with formula feeding compared to breast milk. So are you formula feeding? The baby's getting all that glyphosate in the formula. They're also getting all that fluoride. you're giving them tap water, which also has all these chemicals in it. And then, so the baby's already exposed to all of these heavy metals. They're exposed to the heavy metals in your body while you're pregnant. And then you maybe go get them multiple vaccines at once that have all this aluminum. Is that the thing that pushes them over the edge?
Correct. Yeah.
So that's kind of like how I spiraled on this topic and learned all about
No,
this.
it's absolutely. And you can dive into it, and go into much more detail of where this is all coming from. But, some people, argue that, well, you consume this and this much aluminum a day in your food and we don't see more autism. The difference is with vaccine, you inject it, you bypass the GI tract. But even so, interestingly, I have patients that are autistic that never have received a vaccine. They are out there. But yet when we do testing for heavy metals, they have elevations in aluminum or mercury or whatever. And how could you explain that? Well, the problem again comes back to the gut. If you have a bacteria that releases a lot of LPS, LPS is a structural component of gram-negative bacteria. And if you have them at 60% when there should be 1%, there's a lot of LPS. It melts away the mucosa, the protective layer on the inside of your gut. And that creates a leak. That's where the term leaky gut comes from. So that means that, the absorption of these toxins, it might be anything, glyphosate, heavy metals, mold toxins, we see that a lot. All of these things, when you should have pooped them out, they start to leak into the system. And, the issue, however, is, when you look at autism, we know from our research, not from our research, but from research, that up to 90% of children with autism have gut issues. But then when you flip the table, you have to realize that not every child with gut issues has autism, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be an additional component to it. And we have found this additional component, I think, about 3.5 years ago, when we realized, well, there's a problem with detoxification, specifically sulfation, which has to do with this molecule that the body produces called a thiosulfate, which is an active form of sulfur. And as you know, sulfur is needed for detoxification. We can't produce it. Without it, we would be dead. And so this very special form of sulfur is what it does. It recycles glutathione. It's not making new glutathione, but it recycles glutathione. And if you don't have that and you need to produce it, you cannot make new glutathione. And as you know, glutathione, which most of it sits in the liver, has two functions. It binds toxins and it reduces inflammation. So if these kids have gut issues and these toxins are coming in and they don't have the defenses to bind these toxins, all of it will start to leak into the blood. It will cause histamine reaction, immunosuppression, and these cytokines that cross the brain and cause issues.
Well, and that's what Jenny McCarthy was just talking about on a show. She said that she was disappointed that when the announcements came out about Tylenol, that they didn't explain the science behind it. Yeah. And it's not that necessarily like Tylenol, causes autism or anything, but it does reduce your glutathione.
Correct.
Or however you say it. You're going to say it better than I do. But so, it's just, we need these nuances when we discuss these things, because people are just like, I'm going to take my Tylenol, it's safe. And that never made any sense to me, because you're not supposed to take literally anything else while you're pregnant, but people just thought Tylenol was the magic thing that was okay.
Yeah, it's very sad, and that it was just done so blindly. Same with the antibiotics, same with everything else. Take Miralax, and pediatricians have no idea how harmful this is for a child.
I just got in my pregnancy app, I just got a invite for a clinical trial to try GLP-1s while pregnant.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
Yeah.
or yeah, make sure you take your COVID shot when you're pregnant, right? It's been well studied. Not. Yeah, it's a shame, and I distance myself very much from it. I really don't spend a lot of time worrying about it, because there are two sides of that coin. There's one, how are we preventing new autism cases? Let's discuss the reason for autism, vaccines, and I'm not really into that. It's a tough battle, and so what I'm after is not to go after the beast, but the injured
Yeah.
from the beast. And, how can I help right now? This family is struggling. I don't want to discuss vaccines. It's already done. So
Yeah.
whatever caused this condition for this family, I don't care. Let's go and see how we can help right now, because they need help. They're in a prison. They're suffering. The entire family is suffering, not just the child. And that's what I'm after. God bless all of the people, RFK Jr., Aaron Siri, all of these individuals, Nicole Shanahan, that bring awareness to this. But my fight is different.
Yeah. No, that's an important fight. No, that's a great distinction too. So what were you, that we can talk more detail about? You said something that just happened recently that you guys found or researching.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, really. And it might be a little bit too complex, but I'll try my best. So, there's a lot of talk in autism about it being a mitochondrial problem, right? And there's some very reputable people at the university level that talk about it since years. Yet nobody asks, why? Why is there mitochondrial issues? What's the reason for it? Because, I can tell you, take some carnitine, take some CoQ10 and things like that to support your mitochondria. But, it's like giving Motrin when you have a fever. Yeah, it brings down your fever, but it doesn't address what causes the fever, right? And so the question is, what really causes this? And what we've discovered over the last 4 years by looking at all of these bacteria, when you meet the family, you learn about the symptoms, and then you actually look at the bacteria, started to see patterns of certain bacteria that are able to, they have an enzyme in them that does something very interesting. So when you have these food groups of turkey, beef, chicken, eggs, and dairy, for example, right? These foods have a lot of tryptophan in them. Tryptophan is not something we can make. These food groups, for example, have high amounts of them. When we consume these foods, the tryptophan, usually 90% of it goes towards the production of NAD+, which is a molecule that's helpful for the engine of a cell, the mitochondria, to produce energy, right? About 5 to 10% of that tryptophan is going towards the production of local GI serotonin. Serotonin that doesn't cross into the brain, but it's acting in the GI tract to keep things moving along, so you can go poop. However, now let's say you have a high overgrowth of these bacteria that have an enzyme in it that can steal the tryptophan. And when that happens, and we see it all the time, these bacteria convert the tryptophan into what we call tryptamines.
Okay.
And tryptamines are very psychoactive molecules, meaning they work on the same receptor in the brain as serotonin, but also LSD, psilocybin, and especially DMT. And, this receptor is called 5-HT2A, and it's widely expressed across certain brain regions that we can discuss, that when you hyperactivate them, you actually see all of the symptoms that we see in autism. But so when that happens and these tryptamines are produced, and usually our genetics breaking them down very quickly. There's a gene called MAO, monoamine oxidase, and that usually breaks them down quick. However, what we discovered, what I've discovered when I did all of this genetic testing, is that this MAO gene, boys only have one copy. And that is because it's what we call an X-linked chromosome, X-linked gene, meaning, boys only have one. So they only have one. So if they have that compromised, they don't have, like girls, the option to have the other gene make up for its function.
So that might be why boys are diagnosed more often.
The ratio is 4-1. And so this gene I see all the time working slower. When we do genetic testing, I don't recommend that routinely anymore just to save money. But so they inherently have a problem with breaking down these excess psychoactive molecules. And now what happens is that these tryptamines, when they enter the system, that the liver, the adrenal glands, the lungs, and the brain very easily convert them to very, very potent psychedelic molecules, like dimethyltryptamine, which is you adding 2 methyl groups to tryptamine, You have di-2-methyltryptamine, DMT. And DMT is the world's most powerful psychedelic for humans. There's a book written by Rick Strassman in the 90s that did experiments with DMT, infused it into volunteers, and it was all approved and whatever. And, the reports that these subjects came back with of what they experienced with the DMT is almost too difficult to explain. It's kind of the kind of thing you have to see it to believe it. It's like this ultra reality of geometry and the matrix, and you completely, detach from your physical, and you enter this world of this hyper reality, and that's what DMT does. It's a very powerful hallucinogen. It's more powerful than LSD or psilocybin.
Wow.
And so these molecules get produced. Another derivative of that is called bufotenin, which is not methylated. It's not tryptamine that's methylated, but it's actually what we call hydroxylated serotonin. It's a very similar mechanism. It's a cousin of DMT. And that molecule is also very powerful, dissociative, we call it. You basically separate your ego and your mind from your body. And so these molecules we are going to measure in this study in saliva, blood, and stool of these individuals. And when you then look at, all right, let's assume that they are elevated, that they are high, that these bacteria produce them. Where in the brain do they act? And so you have to look in the brain, well, which areas of the brain have the highest density of receptors for these molecules? And the areas are the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the prefrontal cortex. And so when you look at the thalamus, for example, that's an area in the brain that is a sensory gatekeeper, basically. If we're doing this podcast interview right now, and outside your neighbor is mowing his lawn, and you're like, oh my God, it's so loud, I can't focus. What your brain does is it really just hyper focuses on what I'm saying, and at the same time, you don't hear the sound anymore. And or you sit in church and you're tired because you didn't sleep last night, and the priest is preaching and you didn't pay attention. Even though the sound waves hit your sensory systems, you don't remember anything. It's because your brain, your thalamus, kept that information from hitting your upper brain regions. And so that's our sensory gatekeeper. Now, if you hyperactivate that area with these tryptamines, the gates are coming down, which means every sensory input from sound to vision to feel to touch to taste is hitting the upper cortex. And the brain is very busy at that point to decode all of this information. And that's why we see, some individuals who are able to tell us that they can smell colors, that they can feel numbers, because there are brain regions that started to connect to decode all of the sensory input that, shouldn't be connected, like the region in the brain and the back connecting to the frontal lobes, and we see that on MRI, that there are hyper-connected regions in the brain in autism. And, so that would explain also the sensory overwhelm that a lot of these kids have, right? They hold their ears or they don't like touch, because for them, it might be so different than it is for us. Now, in regards to the basal ganglia, that's the motor control system that sends, commands to the upper brain regions to instruct of what to do. I want to pick up this cup here, or I want to get up off the chair, or I want to coordinate my speech, the pitch, the sound, and everything. When you hyperstimulate those areas, you see these issues with, discoordinated movements, speech problems, OCD, aggressions and things like that. And, we very often talk to individuals that can spell. We ask them, why can't you sit still? Why do you always have to get up and then you come back? And they say, you have to keep me down. I don't want to do this. Keep me on the chair. Or another one is beating up his mom. And we ask the mom asks later, why are you beating me up? And he says, Mom, I don't even know that I'm doing it. And so it kind of really explains that there's an apraxia. And apraxia is a fascinating term. It means that there's a dysfunction in motor coordination and planning, despite the physical ability and desire to do so. So it's like they want to, they can, but they can't. So it's this paradox of what, and what is the reason for that? And it's the same as if I would give you, well, you're pregnant, probably not a good idea, but if I would give somebody LSD, a high dose, or psilocybin, a heroic dose, 5 grams, and we would meet again in 2 hours, it would be very unlikely that you could speak to me, that you would have eye contact, that you would be completely freaked out, that you might be crawling on the floor or looking at the wall or looking at your fingers. It's very similar. And I'm not saying that there's high-dose psychedelic substances in every child with autism, but these are very, very powerful molecules at very, very low concentrations, have a very, very profound effect on, and especially if you look at a child, a 2-year-old child, the brain growing at a rapid speed, you interfere with psychedelic substances. That's what I believe is explaining autism, the big umbrella.
And so have you found like treatment for that specifically?
Well, if you look at the results that we have, with this gut balancing program that Alex has developed, it is very clear that within a very relatively short period that parents see the light at the end of the tunnel. Wow. We had about 3,000 stool samples. We had about 300 families answer these surveys at the end of 6 weeks to kind of see, and then we correlated it with their results. And we saw that 98% of the parents would recommend this program to a friend or another family member, and 93% saw improvement in that child within a 6-week period. I mean, this is really a very short period where
and a lot of them have adults with autism.
Correct.
Like a lot of them are, these kids are not kids anymore. They're like 25, 30, and they're on the severe end. Yeah. And these parents have tried everything. And then you put them on this program, and then within 6 weeks, they see improvement. That's got to be life-changing.
Yeah, and for many it is. And, I don't take it from me. I'm not here to promote anything. We interview these parents. Alex and I, we started a foundation. It's called Autism is Biomedical. It's actually supported by Nicole Shanahan and
that's awesome.
The BioEcho Foundation. And the goal is to sponsor families, to bring awareness to these families that biomedical intervention can bring improvement. And that we sponsor these families for kind of the trade-off to, hey, we will pay for everything, the testing, the supplements, but please tell us your story. So just like this, we sit down and we discuss what their experience was. And so we have about 18 of these interviews on our foundation website, and you hear it from the parents themselves of how this has changed their lives. And, besides that, we have hundreds and hundreds of testimonials via email that we share openly on our websites. And, we have educational videos, we do these podcasts. We're very open with all of this information. Please come and challenge it or discuss it to advance it. We don't know everything. There are a lot of other great interventions for autism. We're not saying this is the only thing, but if you have a family and the child starts to sleep through the night, or they start to potty train, or they start to stop hitting their head, that can be life-changing for a family. And we're seeing it. And then, of course, we're always trying to push further. When those roadblocks are eliminated, how far can we push this? I'm not saying this is all done in 6 weeks. It's just the beginning of giving parents hope to see, look, improvement is really possible when you never thought it would. So
unlike what some people believe that the science is settled on autism, it's not. There's
never
so
settled,
much we don't know. And I always bring this back to smoking. Like if you say it's vaccines or Tylenol, whatever, if it's gut problems, people are like, well, I have gut problems and I'm not autistic. Okay, well, not everyone that smokes gets lung cancer, and not everyone that has lung cancer smokes. But it definitely is correlated that you're more likely to get lung cancer if you smoke. And so that's just something people always need to keep in mind when these things are being discussed. So I want to know about your son. Have you put him on this stuff? I'm sure you have. Like, has he had improvements?
Well, my son, he's going to be 21, like I said, but unfortunately, when he was 4, it didn't work out, and his mom and me separated. I don't know. I blame it on me maybe being completely nuts and diving into the biomedical world. And back then we just had one Dan doctor, we call it. He was in Ann Arbor, and we didn't have anything. So I was literally day and night absorbed in this, and it didn't work out. Primarily because of different opinions of restricting milk or restricting gluten. Or I remember I rented a hyperbaric chamber for the home, and these are things that I thought would be helpful, but it takes two to dance a tango.
Yeah.
And so it didn't work out. So for many years, it was very painful for me to not being able to help my own son.
Yeah.
And it's a thorn in my soul for the rest of my life. However, I have to not force this. I have to be respectful, because these are, I guess, not conventional approaches. And however, I never gave up, and at least I wanted to help other families. And now I'm, sitting back together with his mom, and we're just starting the gut balancing, and had many meetings with her, and she's more open to listening. But he's doing great. So my son has come a long way already, and I can't wait to see how this will impact him. So
yeah, I mean, it's exactly what we talked about at the beginning, like 20 years ago. Gluten, dairy-free, all that stuff was crazy talk.
You were nuts, yeah.
Yeah, and then now it's like normal, like everyone does.
But I went all the way. I mean, about 10 years ago, there was some interesting findings with cannabis, that cannabis could be helpful for autism. And, I started to advocate for it, because a lot of individuals showed great improvement. But back then it was like, it was like medical cannabis, right? Yeah. There's only like a handful of conditions. You had to go to Detroit, knock on a door and say, hey, what do you want? And you had to get your oils there. But it was almost miraculous for some families of how it worked. And so I went with an attorney friend that I met, Michael Comoran. He's here in Michigan, and we went to Lansing, and we said, we want to add autism to be one of the qualifying conditions for the cannabis program. And, you have to go in front of 12 physicians or medical professionals and convince them. So they add it. And of course they were laughing at us and like, what? You want this for children, and then, mentally challenged children. But we failed twice, but then after 3 years, we finally passed it. And now we have 15 states that have autism as a qualifying condition. So yes, I was completely nuts back then. I had my problems with the regulatory agencies in that regards, but I didn't care, because it helped the children. And sometimes, you can't advance science if you don't think that it could be a zebra, when in fact the chances are it's a horse, right?
Well, and so I did a bunch of research about polyester and the impacts on fertility and our health, wearing plastic all the time. And I'm sure that there's really only been one scientist that looked into this, and it was very, very small studies. I always forget his name, but this was like late 90s, early 2000s, where he put pants on dogs and found that the dogs with 100% polyester pants and a 50-50 blend of polyester and cotton ended up being infertile even after taking the pants off for like 6 to 9 months later.
Wow.
So he, after doing numerous studies on dogs, on rats, and eventually on men, it was very small. Like the one with the men was like 12 men. So, I mean, it wasn't a lot at all, but it's just enough to like start thinking about it and start asking questions. And he determined after all his studies that polyester is nature's birth control.
Wow.
And so I know so many people who struggle or have struggled with fertility, And that's just always the thing that comes to my mind. Like, okay, are you wearing plastic underwear? Are you wearing plastic pants all the time? You know,
Wow.
like you need to look into these things. But, you know, for that scientist at the time to do those things, I'm sure he was batshit crazy.
Yeah.
But now we know that our health is declining so bad and that like 70% of our clothes are made from petroleum.
Jeez.
So, yeah, I mean, like it takes a crazy person to start asking questions, you know?
Yes. But I never really cared about that at all because I only always had my son in mind. And I'm like, who cares what anybody thinks?
Yeah.
You're driven by your heart and by God, and this led me to where I'm at. And, you know, we're continuing to work hard to raise awareness and help one family at a time until hopefully someday, you know, somebody will listen and bring this to more people, you know,
Yeah.
not with my company or whatever, but there's millions out there. You know, we're just scratching the surface of the people that we're helping. And it's just a shame that, you know, this is not being addressed more aggressively, to be honest with you, even with the current administration. You know,
Yeah.
they're all looking for, you know, food colorings and banning this and that and looking at vaccines. Yeah, sure. But that's preventative. You know, I want solutions now because
Yeah.
these kids are screaming when you're sleeping and it's not fair. They deserve to be treated first. You know, it's like a car accident. What do? You're trying to figure out, what caused this accident? Or you're going to go look if there's somebody that needs help and that's injured.
Exactly.
And so that's what I'm advocating for. And I don't care who I offend on the way there because I'm there for the parents and not for any, you know, awards or medals or anything like that. So,
No, I think this was a great conversation because I do often think about the prevention, but I don't want to say never, but it's hard to think about the kids that are affected today and how
Right.
can we help them today? Because, you know, a lot of people just think that it's a lost cause. There's no help. You're autistic. That's, you know, you're going to be like that the rest of your life. But
Right.
this is bringing something great into this conversation. So is there any advice or things people can try at home, maybe if they have an autistic kid that they can try, just something like, do you think like going gluten-free and stuff is like a good first step?
You know, in regards to diet, most families that I meet, they're already
Okay.
aware that they shouldn't feed their children crap. I mean, if we have a parent that's kind of saying, oh, he's drinking 4 Mountain Dews a day and, you know, eating chocolate all day, well, it's a different problem. And I rarely get that. So most parents are already very well educated on that. And we're not pushing hard for gluten-free, casein-free, because I grew up with these foods, and why would that be a problem? The problem with gluten and casein is simply that these proteins that are contained in these food groups, you know, per se gluten and casein, that they start to slip into the blood when they should be, you know, digested because of the leaky gut. And, you know, when any protein, which shouldn't be in the blood, absorbed directly, it starts to interact with the immune system, you start to see cross-reactivity, inflammation, all of that, you know, cerebral folate deficiency, you know, where the whole leucovorin discussion comes in. But it's the origins are, again, the gut. And so we don't want to put kids into a bubble in a sterile world. Oh, you can only eat this, and it needs to be organic and gluten-free and everything free. They're bigger fish to fry than that. And I wasted a lot of time. Well, it's never wasted, and if you learn something from it. But yes, diet is important, no doubt. But if you have these bacterial imbalances that we are seeing, no diet will be able to fix that. And that's a big statement, but it won't. Unless you have a personal chef that ferments everything and you know, grows culture-based yogurts for you, yeah, it's just not attainable and feasible. So diet will not fix your microbiome, no matter how hard you try. There's more help that's needed, you know, especially to grow these very beneficial bacteria, lactobacillus and bifido. And you will not fix it by taking probiotics. Because we're talking about, you know, a culture that you need to grow 10 feet down the pipe, you know. 80% of your bacteria are in the last 1/4 of your GI tract in the large intestine. Wow. And by taking probiotics, you have the stomach acid, the small intestine, you're never going to get this down there. So you need to deal with, you know, non-digestible fibers, like acacia fiber, you know, PHGG, or bimuno, sun fiber, different types of fibers that are non-digestible that start to ferment in the large intestine. And this fermentation process creates molecules that feed the bifido and lacto. But which particular regimen you would be on is dependent on your test results. And so, yes, there are a lot of things that you can do, that are much simpler in the beginning, which is, don't feed your child processed foods, keep the sugar down, get adequate sleep, get out, get sunlight. Of course, those things are important. And then make sure the next most important thing, I would say, make sure your kid poops. There are families that come to us that say the child poops every, 5 to 6 days.
Wow.
And you can't tell them to take A, B, and C when there's no, emptying. And so just by having regular good bowel movements, you can improve a lot already in regards to behavior. And it might take some time, but you need to be aggressive about it. And then we go usually step by step. There's yeast overgrowth, there's ammonia burdens. We've correlated a lot of toxicity that comes from the gut, like ammonia, oxalates, or histamine, with clinical symptoms. Like ammonia excess, they're banging their heads because it causes swelling of the brain. It causes giddy laughter, teeth grinding, night wakings, or oxalates cause excess peeing, grabbing privates, poking the eyes, stimming. And we can address them right there, if we just get a good history of what are you observing. Is he stimming? Is he banging? Is he up all night? And then address those issues. Of course, always with the, intention of eventually fixing the microbiome. But I start to do that when the parent is interested to order the gut test. It takes about 4 or 5 weeks until you have everything ready.
Oh, wow.
Until then, to optimize, get the child stronger before you start to engage in this war with the bacteria. Get their liver stronger, open their detox pathways, and reduce the inflammation. There are things like colostrum. There are things like the lotion that I brought you today, which is a molecule discovered which contains the thiosulfate, the molecule that's important to recycle glutathione. Strengthen your liver. Whatever is coming in, tighten up the border so it doesn't slip into the blood. And those things we usually engage with to optimize the systems, open the systems, optimize them, and then we get into the war with the bacteria, to reduce the ones that are too high and to feed the ones that are too low. And we call it gut balancing. Mm-hmm. If anybody's interested, it's autismusbiomedical.com. We have a lot of information there, videos, educational videos, and instructions that if you want to get involved, how to get started, and where to order the test, and how the process works. So it's very feasible, very affordable. This is not, you don't have to spend 10 grand to see if you can, have improvement with your child. This is a $150 gut test, get some supplements. And wow. In my opinion, from all that I have seen over the years, is where we can see the most improvement for the most individuals. And then
that's very hopeful.
Yeah.
So if there was one thing that you wish people knew, what would be that one thing?
Well, I would say to realize that these children are not broken, but that they are burdened. They're burdened by a imbalanced microbiome, by toxins that their little bodies are unable to clear, by a biology that's treatable. We have to stop asking, how do we manage this? But start asking, what is driving all of this? And, I think that we can have meaningful improvements, like real meaningful improvements, if we address these issues for each individual child. Because I think, at the end of the day, the potential that these children have is not being conveyed to the parents. And that's the biggest message, is that we're being told ABA, PT, OT, good luck, nobody cares anymore. That's what you have to do. This is what it is. This is how it will be. It's not true. It's biomedical. It's why we called our foundation Autism is Biomedical. It's very bold. And we, that's what the message that I want to say is that there is help out there. We're parents too, and we wouldn't waste our time if we don't see incredible things happening with families. Look for yourself, the testimonies and interviews that we have done. So, yeah.
Awesome. And then you already said the website, but is there anywhere else that you want people to go to find you, or
Yeah, I do consultations. I have for the last 8 years. You can discuss a lot over Zoom, so it doesn't matter where you are. It starts at the right time, so it's very convenient. It's drbognerhealth.com. Alex, my partner that I work with, he's a very smart guy. Like I said, he's a physicist. We have discovered that another therapy is very effective, which is photobiomodulation. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that or not, but it's basically laser therapy, red photons, which is actually an FDA-approved method for pain. And we discovered that, we have actually receptors on our mitochondria that respond to red photons. And the effect is that the cell will produce more energy and decrease inflammation. And so people started to use it for autism because every chiropractor has a laser device. If you look into a 5-mile radius, you probably find 5 chiropractors that offer laser therapy. And, being used off-label, they've done studies in autism, 4 studies, again, small numbers, like you mentioned earlier, but every single one of them has shown benefits. And, laser therapy is super safe. They're called cold lasers because they don't heat up the tissue. And, Alex started to build them because they're very expensive devices. If you want to buy a laser, they're a little bigger than your iPhone, and they're like between $8,000 and $15,000.
Wow.
And so we saw improvement with our own children. But him being a physicist, he said, there's nothing expensive in here, really. And so he started to build them. And over the last 2 years, he's a genius.
Wow.
And so we have, we're in the laser business, offering affordable laser devices. We have them registered with the FDA. And so they're absolutely incredible. They come with 6 diodes. We have red, green, and violet laser. We're coming out with a near infrared laser. There's a lot to it. It just basically apply it to the head, 10, 15 minutes, once or twice a day. And the results that we're having is, another story. But it's dcllaser.com if anybody's interested. We don't make any claims, so I'm not saying it's helping with autism. Do your own research, but it's very exciting to combine this with the gut balancing and with the research that we're doing. I think we're finally getting somewhere, and I couldn't be more happy. So.
Yeah, I hope just what comes of this and more conversation is just like what you talked about this whole time, just focusing on how we can treat the kids today that have autism. We can also look at prevention, but we also need to look at how we can treat the people that are affected today. So 100%. Hopefully that comes from this. And, thank you so much for coming out and being on the show.
Oh, thank you for all of your advocacy, and best of luck. I hope to be back.
Thank you.